don't know how many of you were there for the proclamation, but this is Ashland's 9th Independent Media Week. And I'm going to read the proclamation for those of you that didn't hear it. An informed citizenry is a cornerstone of democracy. An informed citizenry depends on unrestrained press, which provides greater access to information, more points of view, and greater diversity of thought and fact. The trend towards the consolidation of media ownership has resulted in journalistic practices that hinder public awareness by excluding or marginalizing minority and dissenting viewpoints. Fewer media voices can result in homogenized messaging and the silencing of many points of view. Democratic principles support the case for more independent media in this country, not less. Now, therefore, I do hereby proclaim the week of April 14th through 20th, 2013 as Independent Media Week, and encourage all citizens to seek out and explore the rich diversity of independent media available within and to our community. Our speaker, Charlie Delgado, is a poli-sci grad from Columbia. He is an independent researcher, writer, and human rights advocate. He also writes for the newsletter, co-produces radio shows for KSKQ. He's active with the Rogue Valley Community Press and Healthcare for All Oregon. So he's going to get our little discussion going here about independent media. Thank you, Charlie.
Okay, thank you. This is the first time I'm speaking to the Peace House and for one of these groups here. And I want to thank you guys for inviting me to this. And so the topic today is, what is Independent Media Week? And I guess after that we're going to have a discussion, and I'm going to try to moderate that. But before I begin, I would like to have a moment of silence for the victims that were attacked yesterday in Boston. Thank you. It's a real tragedy, and I don't think anyone here wants to make light of it or trivialize it. And maybe we can get to that after I get through my little speech here about independent media. But certainly this was a sad shock to us all, and in some ways we were all prepared for it. Again, we can talk about that afterwards. As in past years, Independent Media Week is being produced by a coalition of community partners and organizations in Ashland, which will run from April 14th through April 20th, as Karen mentioned, including the Multicultural Association of Southern Oregon, Rogue Independent Media Center, Southern Oregon Jobs with Justice, Citizens for Peace and Justice, the Brain Labor Report, KSKQ, Ashland Community Radio, Rogue Valley Television, Rogue Valley Community Press, Healthcare for All Oregon, and Peace House. RVTV is wholly owned and operated by Southern Oregon University. Independent Media Week is also being sponsored by the United Nations Club at Southern Oregon University. These partners and organizations take initiative for their own events and help provide logistical support and outreach for events of other organizations. Ashland's independent media partners and community volunteers are inviting participation and attendance from all interested citizens and organizations. There will be panel discussions, workshops, and films this week. As in past years, our goals are to celebrate our diverse independent media outlets and to empower our community to use those resources. Wes Brain was one of the founders of Independent Media Week. In Wes Brain's words, anybody can be a citizen reporter. Fortunately, almost everyone has a camera these days. Independent Media Week is about citizen reporters making news. Jason Houck was another founder of Independent Media Week in Ashland.
there's a,
And he stepped out momentarily, but his wife's right over there.
Hey, Vanessa.
Independent Media Week is about the independent media centers, IMCs, that came out of the 1999 Seattle World Trade Organization protests. It is about the Twitter revolutions, the Green Revolution, the Arab Spring in Egypt, all of which involved independent media. In all of these, citizen reporters, using social media, got the news out to the rest of the world when the mainstream media was either not reporting it or reporting lies. We have our own independent media here in Ashland. The type of reporting that we want to create cannot be created from a mold. Rather, from an environment, from independent media networks. Our networks are mature enough to get the word out. That was in Jason's words. In Wes's words, Independent Media Week represents an opportunity for Ashland residents to present independent media, non-commercial, non-mainstream, not bought and paid for media. It finds the news that's in the dark and shines light on it. This fits into the theme of Project Censored. Project Censored was launched in 1976. According to its website, Project Censored is, quote, a media research group of Sonoma State University that tracks news published in independent journals and newsletters and compiles an annual list of 25 news stories of social significance that have been overlooked, underreported, or self-censored by the country's major national news media, end quote. And publishes those stories in an annual publication, Censored, the news that didn't make the news. From 1996 to 2012, Project Censored operated under the direction of Dr. Peter Phillips, PhD. The mission of Project Censored is to teach students and the public about the role of a free press in a free society, and to tell the news that didn't make the news, and why. In 2011, Dr. Phillips was the keynote speaker for Ashland's Independent Media Week. This year it will be Professor Mickey S. Huff, who has taken Dr. Phillips' place as director of Project Censored. Professor Huff co-hosts a weekly radio show with Dr. Phillips, writes for the Daily Censored website, which is a subsidiary of Project Censored, or a project of Project Censored. Teaches at Diablo Valley College in the San Francisco Bay Area. And we are delighted to be hosting Mickey Huff this year, and will be offering his new publication, Censored 2013, for purchase. Thank you. Now, I'm supposed to moderate a discussion, so...
Charles, before you do,
Yeah.
would you share some of your own experiences with us, please?
With Peace House?
No, with the audience.
My own personal experience?
Yeah, and what drew you into independent media and your journey here?
Okay, thanks. Well, I moved up to Ashland in 2006, and that was after I had worked as an insurance agent with Farmers Insurance in California, and I became an insurance and financial services representative with Farmers Insurance Group in 1999, and I remained with them until 2003 or 2004, I think. Actually, 2004. In 2004, I was also a mortgage refinancer and a notary public. So I had my Series 63, which means I could do investment portfolios in mutual funds for folks. I could do insurance, commercial, auto, life, health, long-term care. And and I could do mortgages. So I was actually in a position to set up a one-stop financial services center. But I couldn't study that stuff. And the reason was because I majored in political science at Columbia. And I grew up in Santa Barbara and went 3,000 miles away to go to school in New York. And when I got to Columbia, I found out about the core curriculum, which studies the quote-unquote persistent questions of civilization, Western civilization. And so I read people like Niccolo Machiavelli, which some of you know of. And I read a lot of other political philosophers. I read about political philosophy. I read about political science. And when I majored in political science, I focused on international affairs. So September 11 was bad for me because it was obvious on a common sense level that it never should have happened. Those buildings never should have gotten anywhere near those planes. Should not have gotten anywhere near those buildings. Logistically, it was impossible under normal operating procedures. The buildings never should have collapsed all the way to the ground. That was also impossible under the laws of physics, unless they had some help. So these were just hunches, but they nagged at me. And so then when the United States invaded Iraq in 2004, that bothered me even more, because I knew that Iraq would fall apart. It would implode. The country could not tolerate the toppling of its leader. And I knew that from studying at Columbia as an undergraduate. So I knew the situation was going to turn into a disaster. I knew that in 2004. So actually 2004, I continued to do mortgages until 2006. I was doing mortgage refis in LA for the subprime market. And I made some decent money, but I was just not happy because I was informing myself through independent media of what was going on through the internet. And so I came up to Ashland in 2006, and I really wasn't sure what I was going to do. Finally, I didn't do anything for 2 years. In 2008, I went to work as a cashier at Safeway, as a checker. In 2011, I quit, and I began doing my own writing and research, serious writing and research, on the September 11 attacks and on the invasion of Iraq. But everyone in this room knows that these topics are very heavy topics. They weight down very heavily on a person's soul. They're not easy topics. They're awful topics. And so 2 years ago, I began to work on my spiritual growth. And I began to improve my outlook and my mental well-being, as well as to continue to research this stuff and to continue to do something about it. I became affiliated with KSKQ. I became affiliated somewhat with, or at least informed about the activities of Citizens for Peace and Justice. Thank you, Ellen Hallmark. And Jobs with Justice. And then just recently, Healthcare for All Oregon, and Peace House. And I really didn't get involved with Peace House. I knew about it. I wrote an article for it. I wrote 2 articles for it. And one of the articles I wrote was very controversial. And I was just not in a state of mind that I could provide an uplifting message to people, as well as inform people about what was going on. That's, I guess, the topic was so bad, so depressing for me, that all I could do is give people depressing information. So now,
It's about state affairs.
right, now I have a little bit of a different handle on it. Now I can actually say, I can give people an uplifting, positive message about these things. And I've just continued to do a lot of my own research and writing on this, but I haven't published it. And I can just tell you that there are a lot of authors out there that are not in the mainstream media, and for me, they are also independent media. They are experts in their field. They are scholars. They have published independently. And many of you know this because you've gone to bookstores and found their books and read about them. But the stuff that they write about is not in the news. So then it remains to read about them, to read them, and to read them closely, to understand what they're saying. And on these topics, it's very difficult to understand what these people are saying sometimes, because they speak in innuendo, they speak in indirect reference, insinuation. They're afraid. They don't want to get nailed. They don't want to get caught. They don't want to get killed. Yes, we live in a society now where people are afraid of being killed for being political dissidents. That's where we live, in the United States of America. We have political dissidents in this country that are afraid of being killed. So I've come to that realization, and on topics such as what happened yesterday, I know that is something you have to be very careful about what you say. Everybody has to be very careful about what they say. I actually feel better saying that because it reminds me of a trip that I took with my father in 1969 to Czechoslovakia. My father was a physician, and we went on a family physicians meeting to Czechoslovakia, to Prague. And my father talked with one of the people, actually one of the cooks or one of the dishwashers in the kitchen, because that's the kind of person my father was. He was always, talking to the regular people to find out what the real story was. And this man in Czechoslovakia said, we're afraid. We're afraid to talk here. It's terrible. I can tell you that, what happened, and, he started crying. He was a 26-year-old man, and he started crying, The Soviets came into Czechoslovakia, I think it was in 1957 or 58, and with tanks. And the city was built in the 1400s in Prague. And the Soviets did not blast the old city, and the people were so happy. But they were living in fear, and they were in fear of speaking up, and that's the way this country is getting. So that's the path I've traveled, and that's where I am today. I can speak on a lot of different books that I've read.
Would you, since you
Yeah.
had pointed more than once to the events of yesterday,
Yeah.
would you share your take on the events in Boston? I take it you have a particular insight that you want to share?
Well, okay. Thank you, Herb. I want to quote Vincenzo Vinciguerra, who was convicted of bombings in the 70s in Italy. He said, the government cannot convict itself. And what he was speaking about was something called the strategy of tension. The strategy of tension is something that is written about by Danielle Ganser and Ola Tunander in a book called 9/11 and American Empire. Intellectuals Speak Out, edited by David Ray Griffin and Peter Dale Scott. The strategy of tension is also talked about by Philip Zimbardo, professor of emeritus, professor of social psychology from Stanford University, in his book, The Lucifer Effect. The strategy of tension is a strategy of psychological warfare that is also a form of state terrorism. And what it is its purpose is to create fear in populations. And I can tell you that it's been 12 years since the September 11 attacks. And I can tell you that I would not be surprised if this was the beginning of another wave of terror in the United States. Because so many Americans have forgotten about the September 11 attacks. But let me remind you, the September 11 attacks were criminal acts. And those criminal acts were never investigated. They were never prosecuted as criminal acts. In fact, government officials suppressed the news, obstructed justice, and destroyed evidence. What happened after the September 11 attacks was the anthrax attacks. Anthrax at 1 trillion spores per gram, silica coated, that involved nanotechnology, could only have originated in criminal and covert CIA or Pentagon-controlled labs in the United States. It could not have come from anywhere else in the world. It did not come from some laboratory scientist's basement, and it did not come from some cave in Afghanistan. But worse than that, immediately after the anthrax attacks, there was an obstruction of justice and a destruction of evidence. So, what happened? Well, the anthrax attacks served to terrorize the American Congress and ram through the Patriot Act through Congress. So we have complicity on the part of the FBI in destruction of evidence and obstruction of justice. And we have terrorism. And that is called psychological warfare. So, what happened when the Patriot Act was passed was unconstitutional measures were passed so that we could no longer have any civil rights in this country. They're unconstitutional. But the lack of prosecution in the anthrax attacks is also proof. Well, a deep look into the anthrax attacks is also brings to light evidence of a criminal and covert, illegal, biological weapons program in the United States, in violation of international law and in violation of U.S. law, run by the Pentagon and the CIA, and Battelle Industries in Ohio, and Ames in Ames, Iowa. And what the FBI did was it destroyed the Ames strain of anthrax. That's destruction of evidence. And again, there was no criminal investigation. So what I'm telling you is, in my lifetime, in the past 10 years, the two major terrorist attacks before yesterday were not criminally investigated, were not prosecuted, were covered up, and were obstruction of justice on the part of several agencies of the federal government. And according to law professor Francis A. Boyle of the University of Illinois College of Law at Urbana-Champaign, they are ongoing criminal conspiracies. How does the government get away with this?
Well,
Anybody have?
I was just curious about all the other bombings that have happened, since McVeigh and those guys, okay? Apparently only 2 have been caught in all these years and all these bombings, and I'm like, what? Apparently there's a whole lot of bombings that they've never found who did them or anything. Dozens of them. And I'm just wondering, do you think they're the same, or I don't know?
Well,
It's just
what I think people need to realize is that, number one, as somebody told me yesterday, we need to forget about the idea that the government is going to protect us. Okay, the government is not going to protect us. And number one, as far as the criminal investigations have been concerned, the past is full of examples of incompetence as well as corruption and cover-ups. And the 2 examples I gave you are evidence of obstruction of justice and criminal conspiracy, which are supposed to be felonies. It's supposed to be. But then again, so is mass murder, so is genocide, so is torture. Not only felonies, but international crimes.
Yeah. Charlie,
Yeah.
what do you see as the driving force for this? What forces it in the first place?
What forces it? I don't know what you mean.
Well, who is the gaining party in this? What do they gain by it? Do you have a clear idea?